As Russia's forces continue their faltering push into Pokrovsk, a clear strategy has emerged. A head-on assault on the vital logistical city isn't an option. Ukraine's defenses are too strong for that. Instead, Russia is taking settlements and cities around Pokrovsk, with its goal being to encircle the city and enable strikes from all sides. Dobropillia is one of those cities. And just a couple of days ago, Russia was flying high with reported advances near Dobropillia. However, situations on the Ukrainian battlefield change rapidly. Russia claimed nearby villages close to the city, but not Dobropillia itself. Then Ukraine launched counterattacks, blunting those Russian gains in the area. First, let's rewind to August 13th. On that date, the Moscow Times reported that Russia was making a push toward Dobropillia, which is in eastern Ukraine and is located in close proximity to Putin's main target of Pokrovsk. The Russians weren't in Dobropillia yet, the outlet reported. However, they'd managed to capture a pair of villages nearby, placing the former coal mining city and potential springboard for a Pokrovsk assault at risk. Russia's defense ministry was quick to laud its military's results, releasing a statement that said, "The settlements of Suvarovo and Nikhanarivka in the Donetsk People's Republic have been liberated." This was nothing less than a victory for Russia, and its use of the term liberated feeds into the propaganda the country spreads that the Donetsk region has always been a part of Russia. The settlement Russia refers to as Nikhanarivka is known as Zapovidne in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's forces weren't in Dobropillia yet, but they were knocking on the door by taking a pair of villages that are just 9 miles away from the city amidst a rapid advance that had seen the country's soldiers advance up to 6.2 miles in certain regions of Donetsk in a matter of days. 9 miles may seem like a lot of ground to cover, but with Russia surging, Dobropillia was clearly at risk. By the end of August 12th, Russia had made its largest battleground gains in more than a year, the Moscow Times reported, citing the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, as saying, "The odds are that it was looking to repeat the trick. Ukraine's forces were forced to scramble." Containment of the Russian forces trying to surge into Dobropillia was the goal, the Long War Journal reported on August 13th. Ukraine had called in the Azov Brigade, which is among the country's most lethal and at times brutal special forces units. Their task was to stop Russian forces from penetrating Pokrovsk, meaning that the defense of Dobropillia was high on their agenda. The Azov Brigade took to X to announce their deployment. Several days ago, the 1st Corps Azov of the National Guard of Ukraine assumed responsibility for the designated defense area in the Pokrovsk sector, the brigade said. The situation remains complex and dynamic. The enemy is attempting to advance in this direction at the cost of significant losses in manpower and equipment. Units within the Corps have planned and carried out actions to block enemy forces in the area. Information on the results will be provided later. Not a lot was revealed in that statement beyond the fact that the Azov Brigade had arrived. That was the point. This was a warning to Russia that some of the most elite of Ukraine's forces were en route to solve the Dobropillia problem. Still, arranging the defense would take time. The Azov Brigade would need to coordinate with the units already engaged in the defense of Pokrovsk and the surrounding regions. Plus, Russia was still pushing. Groups of its soldiers had already infiltrated several other villages at this point, and were on the verge of achieving a sharp yet narrow breakthrough into Pokrovsk itself. That situation was critical, demanded the full attention of the Azov Brigade and its compatriots. Dobropillia would have to wait. And Russia took advantage of the delay in the defensive forces arriving. On August 18th, Pravda reported strikes on Dobropillia and Konstantinivka. Civilians were being killed, with Pravda reporting that these strikes killed 4 people, injured 7 more, and caused damage to several residential buildings, along with a shop and catering establishment. This was a small strike, perhaps. However, it was also a sign that Russia's forces were right on the edge of a city that Ukraine could not afford to lose. The Donetsk Oblast Prosecutor's Office took to Telegram to provide more information. On August 18, 2025, the occupiers struck Dobropillia, dropping a Fab 250 with a UMPK module, the office reported. As a result of the attack on the street, a woman died. 3 men aged 26, 31, and 74 were also injured. The victims were diagnosed with mine explosive injuries, fractures, and shrapnel wounds. Harrowing pictures were also shared with the Post, showing the blurred-out bodies of those who had become victims of Russia's latest assault against Ukraine's civilians. The use of Fab 250 bombs in the strike was also worrying. These 550-pound Soviet-era munitions are extremely powerful, and Russia has been converting them into glide bombs with UMPK kits, allowing strikes from a distance against Ukraine's towns and cities. They can also be dropped in their original form by flying bombers directly over their targets. In the case of Dobropillia on August 18th, the Donetsk Oblast prosecutor confirmed it was a Fab 250 equipped with a UMPK glide kit. That bomb, landing at all, showed that Russia was growing confident enough to launch aerial strikes against Dobropillia without fearing Ukraine's air defenses. Russia was no longer knocking on the door of Dobropillia. It was pounding on the door and it was on the verge of breaking through. But for what reason? Why does Dobropillia matter to the Russian military? It certainly isn't a tactically important city, at least in the wider context of the Ukraine war. It's about 48 miles away from the city of Donetsk, and it's hardly a large settlement. Before Putin launched his full-scale invasion, it was home to just 28,000 people. About 5,000 of those people had left by 2025. However, Russia has hit it several times before, though always at range and without the follow-up of a ground-based takeover. Back in June 2014, during Russia's first campaign of aggression against Ukraine, Dobropillia was one of the first settlements Russia shelled with its Grad multiple-launch rocket system in a strike that killed one civilian. In July of this year, just a month before Russia made a push for the city, Russia also launched an airstrike on one of Dobropillia's shopping centers using a fab bomb. 2 people were killed in that attack, with several more being injured. At that point, Dobropillia was a little over 9 miles from the front line. By August 18th, that front line had all but arrived. Still, all of those prior attacks were isolated, jabs delivered to the city by Russia's forces to show that it was on Putin's radar and would likely be attacked eventually. But up until now, Dobropillia was seen as a fairly unimportant settlement. That changed when Russia engaged in the encirclement strategy of Pokrovsk that we mentioned earlier in the video. Suddenly, Dobropillia was much more important. If captured, it could serve as a launching pad for attacks against Pokrovsk, perhaps even being the genesis of an incursion into what Russia saw as an increasingly vulnerable city. After all, Russia had already penetrated parts of Pokrovsk by the time the Fab 250 landed in Dobropillia. In fact, it had penetrated and was then pushed out by the Azov Brigade and several other units by August 18th, as you'll discover if you check out our video covering the exploits of the Azov Brigade in mid-August. Being pushed out of Pokrovsk doesn't mean the Russian forces went away. Instead, they refocused on the encirclement strategy, and Dobropillia was in the firing line. And that brings us to August 19th and the Ukrainian Fightback. On that date, Euromaidan press reported that the situation had grown even worse for Dobropillia. Russia had managed to take another village, Dorozhnya, which lies to the southwest of Dobropillia. It appeared that Russia's forces were attempting to pull off an encirclement within an encirclement. First, encircle Dobropillia until the city could be taken, then use Dobropillia to complete the encirclement and resulting isolation of Pokrovsk. The breakthrough was on, and Russia was in the midst of attempting it. However, Putin's forces didn't consider the possibility that Ukraine could launch a counterattack. The base of the penetrative effort that had seen Russia reach Pokrovsk was already crumbling thanks to the Azov Brigade and the city's defenders. Ukraine's surging forces turned their attention toward Dobropillia in mid-August with the goal of cutting off the base of Russia's penetration altogether. The priority was tackling the Dobropillia encirclement problem. Euromaidan press notes that the Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevets says Ukraine did just that by turning its attention to the villages of Zapovidny and Dorozhnya. Both had been occupied by Russia. Neither would languish under that occupation for much longer. Ukraine liberated these 2 villages, relieving the pressure on Dobropillia's southeast, while preventing Russia's forces from encircling the city. Ukraine didn't stop there. On August 14th, geolocated footage was published, and later confirmed 4 days later, that showed Ukrainian forces capturing a small group of Russian troops in a windbreak southwest of the settlement of Petrivka, which Euromaidan press points out is northeast of Dobropillia. And by August 17th, Ukraine's forces had also managed to retake the settlement of Zoloty Kolodiyaz. More Russian soldiers were captured, as aerial images published on X demonstrated, and Ukraine was able to raise the country's flag in Zoloty Kolodiyaz once more. This was a bruising few days for Russia's forces. Just a few days prior, they were surging towards Dobropillia. All of the territory that Ukraine's counterattack took back was territory that Russia's forces believed they could use as a springboard into Dobropillia. The encirclement was complete. Then just like that, the circle was broken, settlements were retaken, and Russian soldiers were being captured, forcing a retreat. Russia was starting to struggle. UA Wire provided more details, noting that the ISW have observed signs that Russian forces are struggling to turn an initial tactical penetration near Dobropillia into a broader operational breakthrough. More confirmation of Ukraine's success came from Colonel Viktor Tragubov, who is the spokesperson for the Dnipro group of forces. He said that Ukraine's forces had managed to crush a Russian salient, which is an often narrow bulge on the battlefield denoting the advancements of troops in a specific area, that targeted the Dobropillia axis. Infiltration elements had been cut off, the colonel confirmed, and the loss of that salient likely meant that Russia was no longer able to supply the forces that had only days before been so close to taking Dobropillia. The loss of that salient is a massive problem for Russia. Any penetration, no matter how narrow, is a good thing for Russia. In fact, it's part of breaking through a defensive line. The idea is that Russia's forces poke a hole in Ukraine's defenses, with a limited number of troops that break through then bedding down into the territory they've reached. Those embedded forces fortify, laying the groundwork for more soldiers to cross. Slowly but surely, the salient widens, with each extra foot gained in the salient's width, allowing more soldiers to stream through. A once narrow penetration widens, and the front line evolves as enemy forces are pushed back further. If that was the goal, Russia roundly failed, as Ukraine's counterattack cut off the Russian salient from any support it had. There was no widening of the penetration, only a closing of the gap that would result in the Russians surging near Dobropillia being taken out. Where did it all go wrong for Russia? Outside of underestimating Ukraine's ability to launch such a strong counterattack against the settlements it had taken near Dobropillia, Russia simply wasn't able to move as quickly as Ukraine's more agile forces. Mashevets highlights this, Euromaidan Press reports. He says that one of Russia's responses to the oncoming Ukrainian forces was to attempt to use parts of its 8th Combined Arms Army and 150th Motorized Rifle Division to bypass Volodymyrivka to the east of the fighting. The move aimed to flank Ukrainian forces pressing on the Russian units of the 51st Combined Arms Army between Zapovidne and Novotoretsk, Euromaidan Press says. However, Ukraine was already several steps ahead of the Russian flanking attempt. Its forces on the western side of the Russian salient are moving much faster than these limited units, meaning Ukraine can cut Russia off at the pass. The soldiers attempting the flanking were stopped in their tracks, as were their vehicles, with Ukraine turning the tables using flanking maneuvers of its own to force the Russians near Dobropillia to capitulate. As of August 19th, the few Russian forces near Dobropillia are facing increasing pressure. Those that were inside the initial penetration, which include troops from Russia's 5th, 110th and 132nd Motorized Rifle Brigades, are completely cut off from any support and have been successfully flanked by Ukraine's defenders. They are isolated and fighting a losing battle, leading to them fracturing under the intense pressure being placed upon them. It's often said that pressure creates diamonds. This time, it looks like pressure is going to create more Russian casualties. Right now, Euromaidan Press reports that Russian military bloggers are reporting that the Russian forces have been reduced to attempting to hold a 1.5-mile strip in a desperate attempt to keep their salient open. The penetrative gap that allowed them to come close to Dobropillia is closing in around them, and those soldiers are increasingly vulnerable. A Russian military blogger warned the depth of the advance is too great for such a narrow width, making it vulnerable to counterattacks, Euromaidan Press says. So it likely won't be long before we hear about the gap being closed and Dobropillia being safe once more. At least for now. Ukraine unleashed hell when Russia thought it was on the verge of claiming a vital piece of territory. That leaves us to ask what comes next in Dobropillia and, in the wider context, the Russian attempts to take Pokrovsk. Ukraine certainly can't get complacent. With its failures around Dobropillia confirmed, Russia has refocused its efforts on several other territories, including Radinska. Lying southeast of Dobropillia and north of Pokrovsk, that settlement has been a Russian target since at least August 14th. That's according to Sensor.net, which covers a report by the OSGT Dnipro, which says, "The enemy has focused its efforts on capturing Radinska. Over the past 24 hours, it's carried out at least 7 unsuccessful assaults. The defense forces are holding back the offensive, destroying the enemy's superior forces." So Russia isn't slowing down. It's just moving in different directions in an attempt to complete its encirclement of Pokrovsk. With Dobropillia almost secured by Ukraine, Russia is trying to create different inroads into the city that it really wants to take, though Ukraine is defending ably so far. It's possible that the Ukrainian forces that are experiencing so much success in Dobropillia will move on to tackle this new series of Russian assaults. But that's a question of tactics that's up to Ukraine to answer. After all, soldiers moving out of the city that's in the process of being retaken could leave it vulnerable once more. However, failure to support the defenders in Radinska could lead to the settlement being penetrated, which forces the issue anyway. Russia will keep wanting to ask these types of questions of Ukraine as it tries to maintain the pressure it's exerting on Pokrovsk. Speaking of Pokrovsk, it's difficult to anticipate what comes next for the logistical hub that Ukraine has used since the beginning of Putin's invasion to keep its troops in the Donbass supplied. We've already mentioned that Russia has managed to penetrate into the city once already in August, though it was quickly pushed back. Putin made taking Pokrovsk one of the key goals of Russia's summer offensive. So determined was Russia's leader to achieve that goal that he dedicated more than 100,000 of Russia's troops to make it happen. Those troops are using total infiltration tactics to attempt to break through Ukraine's defenses, according to the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrskyi. This represents a change in the traditional Russian tactic of assaulting Ukraine's defenses with large numbers of infantry and mechanized units. The infiltration units are smaller and more agile, making them harder for Ukraine to handle. And in both Pokrovsk and near Dobropillia, we've seen that strategy can be effective. Granted, Russia is struggling to follow up because its infiltrator groups aren't being supported by larger contingents of troops before Ukraine can mount defenses. But it's a tactic that's working to an extent, so Ukraine should expect to spend most of the next few months dealing with these infiltrators around Pokrovsk. One thing is for certain, Putin won't have Pokrovsk by the end of the summer. There are fewer than a dozen days left in August, and the few successes Russia's troops have experienced in that direction of Pokrovsk have been reversed almost as quickly as they happened. Ukraine seems to have figured out a strategy in which it essentially lays traps for Russia's infiltrators. As soon as those infiltration groups break through, they're flanked, encircled, and taken out. Perhaps we may start seeing Ukraine actively baiting Russia into taking minor settlements, only to pull off a similar response to what happened near Dobropillia over the last few days. The pressure won't let up around Pokrovsk. Putin may have been forced to accept that the city won't be occupied by Russia before the end of the summer, but he still wants to take it. The question now is, will Ukraine's defense break? Or will Russia run out of the 100,000-plus soldiers Putin has dedicated to taking Pokrovsk? We can only wait and see to discover the answer. Running out of manpower is a definite possibility for Russia. While it's making slow progress in taking Ukrainian territory, every square mile that is snatched up costs Russia dearly. Putin is on the verge of destroying Russia entirely, and he's done it in return for just 0.97% of Ukraine captured in nearly 3 years. Find out more and what all of this means for Russia in our video. And remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in and around Pokrovsk. And thank you as always for watching.